morning air felt a little colder than usual as she walked through the school gate, holding her bag close to her side. It was her first week at this new place, and everything still felt unfamiliar. The tall buildings, the loud voices, the way students moved in groups as if they had known each other forever. She kept her eyes low, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She wasn't the kind of person who stood out. In fact, she had spent most of her life trying not to. Back at her old school, she had learned that staying quiet was easier. Fewer questions, fewer chances to be noticed, fewer chances to be judged. So she carried that same habit with her here, like something she couldn't put down even if she wanted to. The hallway was already full when she stepped inside. Lockers slammed shut, laughter echoed off the walls, and someone nearby was talking loudly about an upcoming event. She moved carefully, trying not to bump into anyone, slipping through the crowd like she didn't belong to it. Her classroom was at the end of the corridor. She paused for a moment before entering, taking a slow breath as if preparing herself. Inside, students were already seated in small groups, chatting and smiling. Some glanced at her briefly, their eyes curious but quick to move on. To them, she was just another new face, someone who would either fit in or fade away. She chose a seat near the window, away from the center of attention. It was a habit she didn't even think about anymore. From there, she could look outside if things became too overwhelming. The trees swayed gently, and the soft light of the morning sun gave her a small sense of comfort. As the class began, the teacher spoke with a firm voice, introducing the day's schedule. She listened carefully, though she didn't raise her hand or speak unless asked. Her answers, when required, were short and quiet. Enough to get by, but never enough to invite more attention. By the time the bell rang, she had already started to feel tired. Not from the work, but from the effort of blending in. It wasn't easy pretending to be invisible in a place full of people. The rest of the day passed in a similar way. Different classes, different teachers, but the same feeling followed her everywhere. She noticed how quickly friendships formed around her, how easily others laughed and shared stories. It wasn't that she didn't want that kind of connection. She just didn't know how to step into it. After school, she walked home alone, taking a quieter route away from the busy streets. The noise of the day slowly faded, replaced by the soft sounds of evening. This was the part of the day she looked forward to the most. Not because anything exciting happened, but because she could finally be herself again. Her home was small but warm. The moment she stepped inside, she felt a sense of relief. She placed her bag down, changed into more comfortable clothes, and moved toward the corner of the room where an old piano stood. It wasn't new or perfect. Some of the keys were slightly worn, and its surface carried small marks from years of use. But to her, it was more than just an instrument. It was the only place where she didn't feel the need to hide. She sat down slowly, placing her fingers on the keys. For a moment, she didn't play. She just sat there, letting the silence settle around her. Then, gently, she pressed the first note. The sound filled the room in a way that words never could. It was soft at first, almost careful, like she was testing the space. But as she continued, the music began to grow. Her fingers moved with a natural rhythm, one note flowing into the next as if they had always belonged together. There was something different about her when she played. The quiet, reserved girl from school seemed to disappear. In her place was someone more confident, more certain. Someone who didn't need to worry about what others thought. The music carried emotions she never spoke about. The loneliness she felt during the day. The small hopes she kept hidden. Even the fear of being seen. It all found its way into the melody. And somehow, through the piano, those feelings didn't seem so heavy anymore. She played for what felt like hours, though she didn't keep track of time. Each piece she practiced brought a sense of calm, like she was slowly putting herself back together after a long day. No one was there to listen. No applause, no comments, no judgment. Just her and the sound of the piano. And that was enough. As evening turned into night, she finally stopped. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, and she let out a quiet breath. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile. It wasn't something she did often, especially at school. But here, in this small space, it felt natural. She closed the piano lid gently and stood up, stretching her arms slightly. Tomorrow would be another day at school, another day of trying to stay unnoticed. But she knew that no matter how difficult it felt, she would always have this quiet place, this music, this part of herself that no one else could take away. Back in her room, she prepared for the next day. Books were arranged neatly, clothes set aside, everything done with a quiet sense of routine. It was the same pattern she followed every day, a way to keep things simple and controlled. As she lay down, her thoughts drifted back to school. The faces, the voices, the feeling of being surrounded yet alone. It wasn't easy, but she didn't complain. She had learned to accept things as they were. Still, somewhere deep inside, there was a small part of her that wondered what it would be like to be seen. Not judged, not misunderstood, just truly seen for who she was. But that thought felt distant, almost unrealistic. So she pushed it aside, closing her eyes and letting sleep take over. Outside, the world continued as usual. Inside, her quiet journey had already begun. One that no one around her had noticed yet. And for now, that was exactly how she wanted it to be. The morning air felt a little colder than usual as she walked through the school gate, holding her bag close to her side. It was her first week at this new place, and everything still felt unfamiliar. The tall buildings, the loud voices, the way students moved in groups as if they had known each other forever. She kept her eyes low, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She wasn't the kind of person who stood out. In fact, she had spent most of her life trying not to. Back at her old school, she had learned that staying quiet was easier. Fewer questions, fewer chances to be noticed, fewer chances to be judged. So she carried that same habit with her here, like something she couldn't put down even if she wanted to. The hallway was already full when she stepped inside. Lockers slammed shut, laughter echoed off the walls, and someone nearby was talking loudly about an upcoming event. She moved carefully, trying not to bump into anyone, slipping through the crowd like she didn't belong to it. Her classroom was at the end of the corridor. She paused for a moment before entering, taking a slow breath as if preparing herself. Inside, students were already seated in small groups, chatting and smiling. Some glanced at her briefly, their eyes curious but quick to move on. To them, she was just another new face, someone who would either fit in or fade away. She chose a seat near the window, away from the center of attention. It was a habit she didn't even think about anymore. From there, she could look outside if things became too overwhelming. The trees swayed gently, and the soft light of the morning sun gave her a small sense of comfort. As the class began, the teacher spoke with a firm voice, introducing the day's schedule. She listened carefully, though she didn't raise her hand or speak unless asked. Her answers, when required, were short and quiet. Enough to get by, but never enough to invite more attention. By the time the bell rang, she had already started to feel tired. Not from the work, but from the effort of blending in. It wasn't easy pretending to be invisible in a place full of people. The rest of the day passed in a similar way. Different classes, different teachers, but the same feeling followed her everywhere. She noticed how quickly friendships formed around her, how easily others laughed and shared stories. It wasn't that she didn't want that kind of connection. She just didn't know how to step into it. After school, she walked home alone, taking a quieter route away from the busy streets. The noise of the day slowly faded, replaced by the soft sounds of evening. This was the part of the day she looked forward to the most. Not because anything exciting happened, but because she could finally be herself again. Her home was small but warm. The moment she stepped inside, she felt a sense of relief. She placed her bag down, changed into more comfortable clothes, and moved toward the corner of the room where an old piano stood. It wasn't new or perfect. Some of the keys were slightly worn, and its surface carried small marks from years of use. But to her, it was more than just an instrument. It was the only place where she didn't feel the need to hide. She sat down slowly, placing her fingers on the keys. For a moment, she didn't play. She just sat there, letting the silence settle around her. Then, gently, she pressed the first note. The sound filled the room in a way that words never could. It was soft at first, almost careful, like she was testing the space. But as she continued, the music began to grow. Her fingers moved with a natural rhythm, one note flowing into the next as if they had always belonged together. There was something different about her when she played. The quiet, reserved girl from school seemed to disappear. In her place was someone more confident, more certain. Someone who didn't need to worry about what others thought. The music carried emotions she never spoke about. The loneliness she felt during the day. The small hopes she kept hidden. Even the fear of being seen. It all found its way into the melody. And somehow, through the piano, those feelings didn't seem so heavy anymore. She played for what felt like hours, though she didn't keep track of time. Each piece she practiced brought a sense of calm. Like she was slowly putting herself back together after a long day. No one was there to listen. No applause, no comments, no judgment. Just her and the sound of the piano. And that was enough. As evening turned into night, she finally stopped. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, and she let out a quiet breath. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile. It wasn't something she did often, especially at school. But here, in this small space, it felt natural. She closed the piano lid gently and stood up, stretching her arms slightly. Tomorrow would be another day at school, another day of trying to stay unnoticed. But she knew that no matter how difficult it felt, she would always have this quiet place, this music, this part of herself that no one else could take away. Back in her room, she prepared for the next day. Books were arranged neatly, clothes set aside, everything done with a quiet sense of routine. It was the same pattern she followed every day, a way to keep things simple and controlled. As she lay down, her thoughts drifted back to school. The faces, the voices, the feeling of being surrounded yet alone. It wasn't easy, but she didn't complain. She had learned to accept things as they were. Still, somewhere deep inside, there was a small part of her that wondered what it would be like to be seen. Not judged, not misunderstood, just truly seen for who she was. But that thought felt distant, almost unrealistic. So she pushed it aside, closing her eyes and letting sleep take over. Outside, the world continued as usual. Inside, her quiet journey had already begun. One that no one around her had noticed yet. And for now, that was exactly how she wanted it to be. The next few days at school followed the same quiet pattern. She arrived early, took her usual seat near the window, and kept her focus on her books. No one really spoke to her unless it was necessary, and she didn't try to change that. Felt safer this way. Predictable. Calm. But not everything stayed the same. One morning, a notice was written on the board before class started. It was about a music session that would be held later that week. Students would be asked to take part in simple activities. Nothing serious, just a way to explore talent, as the note said. The class reacted quickly. Some students seemed excited, already talking about what they would do. Others joked about who would embarrass themselves the most. Laughter filled the room, loud and careless. She read the notice quietly, her eyes moving over the words again and again. Music session. It should have felt comforting. It was the one thing she understood better than anything else. But instead, she felt something else. Unease. At home, the piano was her space. At school, it would be different. There would be eyes watching, voices judging, people waiting for mistakes. That thought alone made her chest feel tight. She lowered her gaze and turned the page of her notebook, trying to ignore the conversations around her. Later that day, the music teacher entered the classroom for the first time that week. The room slowly grew quiet, though not completely. The teacher had a strong presence, the kind that made students sit a little straighter without being told. The lesson began with simple questions. What is rhythm? What is melody? Some students answered confidently, raising their hands quickly. Others avoided eye contact, hoping not to be called. She stayed still in her seat, her hands resting on her notebook. She knew the answers. They were basic things she had learned long ago. But knowing and speaking were two very different things. The teacher's eyes moved across the room, observing each student carefully. There was a certain sharpness in that gaze, like they were measuring something invisible. Then, without warning, the teacher called on her. For a moment, she didn't even realize it. It was only when the room grew unusually quiet that she looked up. All eyes were on her now. She felt her throat tighten slightly. "Can you explain what melody means?" the teacher asked, voice calm but firm. She hesitated just for a second. Not because she didn't know, but because speaking in front of everyone felt like stepping into a spotlight she had never asked for. "It's the main part of a song," she said softly. "The part you remember." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear enough. The teacher watched her for a moment, expression unreadable, then gave a short nod and moved on. The class continued, but something had shifted. A few students glanced at her differently now. Not impressed, not curious, just slightly aware of her presence in a way they hadn't been before. She lowered her eyes again, wishing the moment would fade as quickly as possible. The next day, the music session became the main topic. Students were told they would have to participate in small demonstrations. Nothing too complex, just clapping rhythms, identifying notes, maybe even trying a short piece on the piano. The word piano caught her attention immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around her pen. She had spent years playing. Not in front of crowds, not for praise, but simply because it felt right. But here, in this setting, it didn't feel like something she wanted to share. Around her, the excitement continued to grow. "I'm definitely not going near that piano," one student laughed. Another replied, "Someone will mess up for sure. It's going to be funny." Their voices carried across the room, light and careless, but they made her feel even smaller somehow. She stayed quiet as always. When the day of the session finally arrived, the classroom felt different. Desks were arranged slightly to the side, leaving space at the front. The piano stood there, simple but noticeable, as if waiting. Students walked in with mixed expressions. Some excited, some nervous, some pretending not to care. She took her usual seat, but her eyes couldn't help drifting toward the piano. It looked different here than it did at home. Less familiar, less safe. The teacher entered and began explaining the activity. Each student would take a turn. Nothing complicated, just enough to see their comfort level with music. One by one, students went forward. Some clapped rhythms correctly, others made small mistakes and laughed them off. A few tried playing simple notes on the piano, their hands unsure but willing. The room was filled with a mix of encouragement and quiet amusement. She watched everything carefully, her heart beating a little faster with each turn. Then the teacher's eyes moved toward her again. "You haven't participated yet," the teacher said. Her stomach tightened. "It's just a simple exercise," the teacher added. "Come forward." The words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. For a moment, she considered shaking her head, saying she didn't want to. But all the eyes in the room made that feel impossible. Slowly, she stood up. Each step toward the front felt heavier than the last. The whispers started again, low but noticeable. "She looks nervous. Maybe she doesn't know anything." She kept her eyes down, focusing only on reaching the piano. When she finally stood beside it, she paused. The keys were right there, familiar yet distant at the same time. The teacher spoke again. "Just try a few notes." Simple words, simple request. But to her it felt like much more. She sat down slowly, her hands resting in her lap. For a brief moment, she didn't move. The room felt too quiet now, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Her fingers lifted slightly, hovering over the keys. She could feel the pressure building, not from the task itself, but from the expectation, the watching, the silent judgment. Then gently, she pressed a key. The sound was soft, almost uncertain. She played a few more notes, simple and careful, just enough to complete what was asked. Nothing more. The teacher observed her closely, arms crossed. "That's all?" the teacher asked. She nodded slightly, unable to meet their eyes. There was a pause, a long one. Then the teacher gave a small, almost dismissive nod and motioned for her to return to her seat. As she walked back, the whispers followed again. Not loud, not cruel, but enough to make her feel exposed. She sat down quickly, her hands resting tightly together. Inside, something felt unsettled. It wasn't that she had made a mistake. She hadn't. But she also hadn't shown anything real. She had held back, played safe, stayed hidden. And somehow that felt worse. The rest of the session continued, but she barely paid attention. Her thoughts stayed with that moment, the piano, the silence, the feeling of holding something back that wanted to come out. When the bell rang, students left the room talking about the activity. Some laughed, some shrugged it off, already moving on to other things. She stayed seated for a moment longer, watching the emptying classroom. The piano was still there at the front, quiet now. For a brief second, she imagined what it would have felt like to really play. Not just a few notes, not just enough to get by, but something real, something honest. But that thought slipped away quickly. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out like she always did. Quiet, unnoticed, carrying more inside her than anyone could see. And somewhere in that silence, the tension continued to grow, waiting for a moment when it could no longer stay hidden. The next morning didn't feel like any other morning. From the moment she stepped into the school gate, there was a strange tension in the air. It wasn't loud or obvious, but she could feel it. Small groups of students were already talking, their voices a little more energetic than usual. Some were even glancing toward the music room as they passed by. She walked the same path as always, holding her bag close, keeping her eyes low. But her mind wasn't calm today. It kept returning to what had happened the day before. The piano, the few soft notes she had played, the way the teacher had looked at her afterward. That's all. Those words stayed with her. She reached her classroom and sat by the window, just like always. The outside world looked peaceful. The trees moved gently, and the sunlight fell in quiet patterns on the ground. But inside the classroom, things felt different. A few students were already talking about yesterday's session. She barely played anything, one voice said from the back. Yeah, like she didn't even try, another replied. A soft laugh followed. She kept her eyes on her notebook, pretending not to hear. But the words didn't just disappear. They stayed, settling somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't anger she felt. It wasn't even embarrassment in the usual sense. It was something quieter, heavier, like a question she didn't want to answer. Why didn't she play? She knew the answer. Fear. Not of the piano, but of being seen. The class went on as usual, but her focus wasn't the same. Every now and then, her thoughts drifted back to the music room, to the piano, to that unfinished moment. By midday, a message came that surprised everyone. The music teacher would be holding another short session that afternoon. Anyone who wanted to try again could step forward. It wasn't required, but it was encouraged. The classroom buzzed with reactions. Another chance? Why though? Maybe someone messed up too badly, someone joked. Laughter followed again. She didn't laugh. She just sat still, her fingers lightly pressed against the edge of her desk. Another chance. The words felt both inviting and frightening. She told herself she wouldn't go. There was no reason to. She had already done what was asked. There was no need to draw more attention. But something didn't sit right with that thought. The rest of the day moved slowly, as if time itself had stretched. Each class felt longer than usual. Each minute gave her more time to think. And the more she thought, the harder it became to ignore the feeling inside her. By the time the final bell rang, students began heading toward the music room again. Some out of curiosity, others just for entertainment. She stayed in her seat. For a moment, then she stood up. She didn't fully understand why. Her feet just moved, carrying her toward the same place she had felt so uncomfortable in just a day before. The music room was already half full when she arrived. Students stood around casually, some leaning against desks, others sitting wherever they could. The piano stood at the front again, quiet and still. The teacher was there too, watching as students settled in. She slipped into a spot near the back, hoping not to be noticed. The session began without much introduction. Yesterday, some of you held back, the teacher said, voice steady. Today I want honesty, not perfection, just honesty. The room grew quiet. A few students went first. Some improved from the day before, showing a little more confidence. Others stayed the same, laughing off small mistakes. The mood was lighter than before, but there was still something else beneath it. An expectation, waiting. She stood still in the back, her heart beating just a little faster now. Then, without warning, the teacher spoke again. "You," the teacher said, looking directly at her. Her breath caught. "Come forward." The room turned toward her almost instantly. This time, the whispers weren't as soft. "Again. She's going to do the same thing. Why her?" Each word felt sharper than before. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she stepped forward. The walk felt longer this time. Heavier. Like every step carried not just her weight, but all the thoughts pressing down on her. When she reached the piano, she stopped. The teacher stood nearby, watching closely. "Yesterday, you played like you were afraid," the teacher said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear. "If that's all you can do, then just say it." The words hung in the air. A few students shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, curious. Her hands felt cold. She could walk away. She could nod, say nothing, return to her seat, and let this moment pass like everything else. That would be the easier choice. But something inside her didn't agree. She sat down. The bench felt the same as before, but everything else felt different. This time, she didn't place her hands on her lap. She placed them on the keys. For a moment, she didn't play. She just sat there, feeling the quiet of the room, the weight of the moment, the eyes watching. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Then she closed her eyes. Not for long, just enough to block everything out. When she opened them again, something had changed. Her fingers moved. The first note came out soft, like before. But this time it didn't stop there. Another note followed. Then another. The melody began to take shape, slow and gentle at first. The room grew quieter, the small whispers fading away. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't think about what they expected. She just played. The sound grew stronger, more confident. Her hands moved more freely now, no longer hesitant. The music carried something deeper this time, something real. It wasn't just about playing correctly. It was about feeling. Each note flowed into the next, building something that hadn't been there before. Something honest. The room didn't laugh. No one whispered. They listened. Even the teacher didn't speak. She kept going, her focus entirely on the piano. The world around her seemed to disappear, just like it did at home. For the first time in that room, she wasn't trying to stay invisible. She wasn't holding back. And the difference could be felt in every note. The melody rose, then softened, then rose again. Like a quiet story being told without words. Some students leaned forward slightly, their expressions no longer amused, but attentive. This wasn't what they expected. Not at all. She continued, her hands steady now, her movements natural. The fear hadn't completely disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. And for the first time, she let the music speak louder than anything else. The moment stretched, holding everyone in it. And no one dared to break the silence. Because something important was finally happening. And they could all feel it. The sound of the piano didn't stop when anyone expected it to. At first, people thought she would play only a few notes again, just enough to get through the moment. That's what they had seen before. That's what they assumed would happen again. But this time, the music didn't fade after a few seconds. Continued, growing stronger, fuller, more certain. Her fingers moved with a quiet confidence now, no longer stiff or unsure. Each note carried weight not because it was loud, but because it felt real. There was something in the way she played that made people stop thinking about themselves and start listening. The room slowly changed. At the back, the small whispers that had once filled the space disappeared completely. Even the students who had been leaning casually against the desks now stood still, their attention fixed on the front. A few who had been smiling before now looked serious without even realizing it. She didn't notice any of it. Her focus stayed on the keys, on the movement of her hands, on the feeling of the music flowing through her. It was the same feeling she had at home, sitting alone in that small room, where nothing else mattered. But here it was stronger somehow. deeper. The melody shifted gently, becoming more emotional. It carried a quiet sadness at first, like a memory that stayed hidden for too long. Then it slowly lifted, turning into something softer, almost hopeful. It was as if she was telling a story without using any words, letting the music speak in a way she never could. Her breathing steadied. The nervous tension in her shoulders faded. The fear that had followed her all day didn't disappear completely, but it no longer had control over her hands. She played like she meant it. Near the front, the teacher watched closely. At the start, there had been doubt in that gaze. A belief that this would be another short, uncertain attempt. But that expression began to change. The teacher's posture straightened slightly, arms no longer crossed as tightly. The sharpness in their eyes softened, replaced by something else. Attention, maybe even surprise. The music continued to build. It wasn't overly complicated, but it didn't need to be. Every note felt placed with care. Every pause felt intentional. There was a natural flow, something that couldn't be forced or copied. Somewhere in the room, a student shifted their weight quietly, as if afraid to make any sound that might break the moment. Another leaned forward, resting their elbows on their knees, eyes fixed on her hands. Time seemed to slow down. What had started as a simple exercise had turned into something no one expected. No one spoke about it, but they could all feel it. This wasn't just someone trying to play a piece. This was someone showing a part of themselves they had kept hidden. And it was impossible to ignore. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. There was control in every motion. The music rose gently, then dipped again, like waves that knew exactly where to go. She didn't look up once. If she had, she might have stopped. She might have remembered where she was, who was watching, what they might be thinking. But she didn't give herself that chance. She stayed in the music. The final part of the melody began to form, though no one knew it yet. It softened slightly, like the end of a long thought. The notes became lighter, but no less meaningful. There was a quiet beauty in that ending, something that made the room feel still. Then, slowly, the last note faded. Her fingers remained on the keys for a second longer, as if holding onto the moment. Then they lifted gently. Silence followed. Not the usual kind of silence filled with whispers or small movements. This was different. It was still almost heavy, like the room itself was taking a breath. She stayed seated, her hands resting lightly in her lap now. For a brief second, she wondered if she had done something wrong. The silence stretched. Then, somewhere near the middle of the room, a soft sound broke through. A single clap. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to shift something. Another clap followed. Then another. Within moments, the room filled with applause. It wasn't forced or polite. Felt real. Honest. Some students clapped slowly, as if still processing what they had just heard. Others clapped with more energy, their earlier expressions of doubt completely gone. She didn't move. The sound felt distant, almost unreal. She wasn't used to this. At home, there was no audience, no reaction, just silence after the music ended. Now everything was different. She looked up slowly. For the first time, she saw their faces clearly. No laughter, no whispering, no dismissive looks, only surprise, and something else, respect. Her chest felt tight again, but not in the same way as before. This feeling was unfamiliar, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Near the front, the teacher hadn't clapped immediately. They stood still for a moment longer, watching her carefully. Then, slowly, they brought their hands together as well. Not as loudly as some of the students, but just as sincerely. The applause continued for a few more seconds before it began to fade. The room returned to silence again, but this time it felt different. Lighter. She stood up quietly from the bench. Her legs felt slightly unsteady, but she managed to step away from the piano. Each step back toward her place felt strange, like she was walking through a moment she didn't fully understand yet. As she passed by the rows of students, a few of them glanced at her in a way they never had before. Not with judgment, but with curiosity, with quiet admiration. She sat down slowly. Her hands rested on her desk, but they still felt the memory of the keys. At the front, the teacher finally spoke. "That," they said, pausing briefly, "is what happens when you stop holding back." The words were simple, but they carried meaning. The teacher didn't say anything more right away. It was as if they were choosing their next words carefully. The room stayed quiet, everyone waiting. Then the teacher added, "You had that ability yesterday. You just didn't show it." There was no harshness in the tone this time, no challenge, just a calm statement. She lowered her eyes slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit. But inside, something had shifted. She had shown it, even if just for a few minutes. Even if it felt overwhelming, she had let it be seen. The rest of the session continued, but it felt different now. The energy in the room had changed completely. Students who went forward after her seemed more focused, more careful. Some even tried harder, as if inspired in a quiet way. But no one forgot what they had just witnessed. And neither did she. As the session ended and students began to leave, the usual noise slowly returned. Conversations started again, but this time, they carried a different tone. "Did you hear that? I didn't expect that at all." She was so quiet. The words followed her as she picked up her bag. She didn't stop to listen. She didn't need to. For the first time since she had joined the school, she didn't feel invisible. And for the first time, that didn't scare her as much as she thought it would. Because now, she knew something important. The part of her she had been hiding wasn't weak. It was powerful. And once it had been heard, it couldn't simply disappear again. The moment didn't end when the applause stopped. It followed her. As she stepped out of the music room, the hallway felt different, even though nothing had physically changed. The same walls, the same noise, the same students moving from one place to another, but something about the way people looked at her had shifted. Not everyone noticed her, but the ones who didn't look past her anymore. A few students who had been in the room earlier whispered as she passed by. Their voices were lower this time, not careless like before. "That was her, right? Yeah, I didn't know she could play like that." She kept walking, her steps steady, her eyes still lowered, but her mind was far from calm. The sound of the piano stayed with her, repeating in small pieces, like her thoughts were trying to understand what had just happened. She had played in front of people. Not just played. She had let herself be heard. And now there was no way to take that moment back. When she reached her next class, the room was already half full. A few students looked up as she entered. One or two held their gaze a second longer than usual before looking away. She took her usual seat by the window. For a moment, everything felt normal again. The quiet, the routine, the comfort of staying in the background. But it didn't last long. The student sitting nearby leaned slightly toward another and whispered, not quietly enough, "That's the one." The other nodded, glancing at her briefly. She felt the words more than she heard them. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't loud. But it was enough to remind her that something had changed. She focused on her notebook, trying to return to the same calm state she had before. But her thoughts kept drifting back. To the piano. To the silence before the applause. To the way the room had listened. The class went on, but it felt distant, like she was only half there. By the time the final bell rang, the school seemed louder than usual. Or maybe she was just more aware of everything now. As she walked through the hallway, someone called out behind her. "Hey!" She stopped, unsure if it was meant for her. "Yeah, you." She turned slightly. A student stood a few steps away, looking a bit uncertain, as if they weren't used to starting conversations like this. "That piano thing," they said, pausing briefly. "It was really good." The words were simple, but they felt heavier than they should have. She didn't know how to respond right away. Compliments weren't something she was used to, especially from people who didn't know her. "Thank you," she said quietly. The student gave a small nod, then walked off, as if that was all they needed to say. She stood there for a moment longer before continuing on her way. It wasn't a big interaction. It didn't last more than a few seconds, but it stayed with her. At home, things were the same as always. The small space, the quiet evening, the familiar comfort of being alone. She placed her bag down and walked toward the piano without thinking. The room felt calm just like before. She sat down and rested her fingers on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. Her mind replayed the earlier moment. The room full of people, the silence, the applause. It felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. Then she pressed a key. The sound was clear, steady. She played a few notes, slowly at first, then let the melody grow. But something was different. Not in a bad way, just different. Before, the piano had been her private world. A place where nothing from outside could reach her. But now, that world had been seen by others. And that changed how it felt. She stopped for a second, her fingers hovering over the keys. A thought crossed her mind. Was it still hers? Or had something shifted now that others knew? She didn't have an answer, so she played again. This time, she didn't think about the classroom. She didn't think about the teacher or the students or the way they had reacted. She just focused on the music. Slowly, the familiar feeling returned. The calm, the connection, the quiet understanding between her and the piano. And she realized something. Nothing had been taken from her. If anything, something had been added. The music didn't feel smaller because others had heard it. Felt stronger, more real. She continued playing, letting that thought settle. Back at school, things continued to shift in small ways. The next morning, as she entered the classroom, a few students greeted her with brief nods. Nothing dramatic, nothing overly friendly, but different from before. She nodded back slightly, unsure but not uncomfortable. During class, the teacher spoke as usual, but there were moments when their eyes paused on her a second longer than before. Not with doubt, not with challenge, but with recognition. That alone felt strange. At one point, the teacher asked a question about musical structure. This time, when her name was called, she didn't hesitate as long. Her answer was still soft, still simple, but clearer. The teacher gave a small nod. That's correct. The words were the same as before, but they didn't feel the same. There was no hidden doubt in them, just acknowledgement. Later that day, the music room door was opened during a break. A few students stood inside, talking casually. The piano sat quietly in its place. She paused near the doorway. For a second, she considered walking away. But instead, she stepped inside. The room felt different now, less intimidating, less distant. One of the students noticed her and stepped aside slightly, giving her space without saying anything. She walked closer to the piano. Her hands rested lightly on the edge. No one asked her to play. No one laughed. No one whispered. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was open. She didn't sit down. Not yet. But she didn't leave either. And that alone meant something. As the day went on, the changes continued, small, quiet, but real. Respect didn't come in loud moments. It showed in simple things. In the way people looked at her. In the way they spoke around her. In the space they gave her without pushing her away. Even the teacher seemed different. Not overly kind. Not overly strict. Just aware. At the end of the day, as she packed her bag, she paused for a moment. Her life hadn't completely changed. She was still the same person. Still quiet. Still careful. Still someone who preferred staying in the background. But now there was something else alongside that. A moment that couldn't be undone. A truth that had been seen. And a quiet shift that was still unfolding. As she walked out of the classroom, she didn't lower her head as much as before. Not completely. Just a little less. And for her, that was enough. Because change didn't always come in big steps. Sometimes it came in small, steady moments. And she had already taken the first one. The days that followed didn't return to how they used to be. Something quiet had changed. And it stayed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no big announcements or sudden friendships forming overnight. But in small, steady ways, the space around her felt different. People no longer looked through her as if she wasn't there. Now, when she walked into a room, a few eyes would notice. Not in a judging way, but in a way that said they remembered. She still chose the same seat by the window. She still kept her voice soft. She still preferred silence over unnecessary talk. But the silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. During one class, the teacher paused while explaining something and looked toward her. "Can you explain that again in your own way?" the teacher asked. A few weeks ago, that question would have made her freeze. Her mind would have gone blank, her voice unsure. Now she took a small breath. "It means you don't just follow the notes," she said slowly. "You understand how they connect." Her words were simple, but they were clear. The teacher nodded. Exactly. That small moment stayed with her longer than she expected. It wasn't about getting the answer right. It was about being heard without fear. Later that day, something unexpected happened. As she walked past the music room, she heard the sound of someone playing. It wasn't smooth or confident, just someone practicing, making small mistakes, trying again. She slowed her steps without thinking. The door was slightly open. Inside, a student sat at the piano, repeating the same part over and over, clearly struggling but not giving up. She stood there quietly, watching. For a moment, she thought about walking away, but instead, she stepped inside. The student noticed her and stopped playing, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm just trying to figure this out," they said quickly. "I'm not very good." The words felt familiar. She shook her head slightly. "You just need to slow down a little." Her voice was soft, but steady. The student hesitated, then moved slightly to the side. "Do you want to show me?" The question caught her off guard. She had never been asked that before. For a second, she thought about saying no. But then she sat down. Her hands rested on the keys, just like they always did. But this time, she wasn't playing for herself. She wasn't even playing to prove anything. She was helping. She played the same part slowly, breaking it into smaller pieces. Each note clear, each movement simple. "Try it like this," she said. The student watched closely, then tried again. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. They smiled slightly. "Oh, that makes more sense." She nodded. It was a small moment, but it meant something. For the first time, the piano wasn't just her escape. It was something she could share. Over the next few days, moments like this began to happen more often. Not in big ways, just small interactions. Someone asking a quick question. Someone sitting near her instead of choosing another seat. Someone saying good morning without hesitation. She didn't suddenly become outgoing. She didn't change who she was. But she stopped trying so hard to disappear. That alone made everything feel lighter. Even the teacher's approach had changed. One afternoon, after class, the teacher called her to stay back for a moment. Her first reaction was the same as always. A slight tightening in her chest, a quiet worry about what might be said. She stood near the desk, waiting. The teacher looked at her, not with the same sharp expression as before, but with something calmer. "I misjudged you," the teacher said plainly. The words were direct. No long explanation, no complicated reasoning, just honesty. She didn't know what to say at first, so she stayed quiet. "You had that ability from the start," the teacher continued. "You just didn't let anyone see it." She looked down slightly. "That doesn't make you weak," the teacher added. "But it does mean you have more to give than you think." The room felt still. There was no pressure in those words. No demand. Just a quiet understanding. "You should keep playing," the teacher said. "Not for others. But don't hide it either." She nodded gently. That was enough. When she left the classroom, the hallway felt the same as always. But she didn't feel the same inside it. Later that evening, at home, she sat at the piano again. The room was quiet, just like it had always been. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The music came easily. But now it carried something new. Not just emotion, not just escape, but confidence. Not loud or overwhelming, just steady, real. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress anyone. She just played. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to choose between being hidden and being seen. She could be both. Days turned into weeks. The changes didn't disappear. They stayed. She still had quiet days. She still had moments where she preferred to be alone. But she no longer felt invisible. And more importantly, she no longer wanted to be. One afternoon, the school held a small event. Nothing big. Just a simple gathering where students could share different talents. There was no pressure to join, no expectations. But her name was written on the list. She hadn't put it there. Someone else had. At first, she thought about removing it, walking away, pretending she hadn't seen it. But she didn't. When her turn came, she walked to the piano. This time, the room was bigger. More people. More noise. But the feeling inside her was different. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The first note was steady. The second followed naturally. The music grew just like before, but stronger. Not because the room was larger, but because she was no longer holding back. The audience grew quiet. Not because they were told to, but because they wanted to listen. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She already knew something important. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about shocking people. It wasn't about being better than anyone else. It was about being honest. When the music ended, the silence returned. Then came the applause. But this time it didn't surprise her. She stood up calmly, gave a small nod, and walked back. Not quickly, not nervously, just naturally, like she belonged there, because she did. And as she returned to her seat, she realized something simple but powerful. The moment that once felt like pressure had become something else. An opportunity, a beginning, not of a new person, but of a more complete version of herself. And she didn't need to hide that anymore.